Her father sold her at midnight to pay a gambling debt, £10 for the girl, he said. Silas Thorne dropped the heavy leather satchel onto the mahogany desk. Arthur Vance signed his daughter away to pay a gambling debt at midnight. This was the exact transaction Eleanor Vance watched from the shadows of the library. She stood barefoot on the freezing rug, wearing only a thin nightgown and a winter cloak, watching her future being traded before sunrise. Thorne reached out a thick hand to claim his property, dragging her forward into the cold. Then the front door did not merely open, it shattered into splinters. Julian Blackwood, the Mad Duke, did not enter the room to lock her in a new cage. He threw down the estate deeds, bought her father debt, and cast the creditors into the freezing blizzard just to set her free. The turnaround was complete in less than 60 seconds, leaving Eleanor standing in the ruins of her childhood home with a monster who had just given her a choice. Now let us understand how a daughter sold in the dark became the woman no one could command. The frost on the leaded glass windows of Vance Manor was thick enough to block the midnight sky. There are debts a man accumulates in the light, with merchants, with tailors, with the gentlemen of his club who lend him a sovereign over the card table and expect it returned by Thursday. These are the debts of a functioning life, ordinary and manageable, the kind that a careful man retires before they become character. And then there are the other kind. Arthur Vance had the other kind. For 3 years the Vance estate had been dying the way old houses die, not in a single catastrophic collapse but in the quiet, incremental surrender of one thing after another. The north pasture sold in the first year to cover a note from a Mayfair club. The horses went in the second year, one by one, the good ones first, then the carriage pair, then the old grey hunter Eleanor's mother had ridden before she died. The silver followed the horses. The paintings followed the silver. And all the while Arthur Vance sat in the library with his ledgers and his brandy and his profound, practiced inability to connect the decisions he made at midnight with the consequences that arrived at dawn. Eleanor had watched all of it. She had spent those 3 years doing the work her father could not. She balanced the books he abandoned, corrected the errors of the clerk he could no longer afford to pay properly, calculated the exact cost of their survival down to the last shilling. She knew the value of every acre of frozen ground, every outstanding note, every clause in every mortgage agreement the estate had ever entered. She had taught herself the language of financial ruin the way you teach yourself to read in a burning house, quickly, completely, because the alternative is darkness. But she had not factored herself into the accounting. That was the error she would spend the rest of her life understanding. The frost on the leaded glass windows of Vance Manor was 2 fingers thick on the night of the 23rd of December. The blizzard had begun at dusk, burying the lanes under a foot of white, sealing the house from the outside world with the particular finality of a winter that has decided to make a point. Eleanor had gone to bed at 10 o'clock with a candle and a volume of agricultural law she was using to understand the tenant dispute on the north field. She had been asleep for less than an hour when the voices woke her. She came downstairs barefoot, her thin nightgown covered only by the heavy winter cloak she had pulled from the hook at the top of the stairs. She moved without a candle because the light in the library below told her someone was already there, and something in the quality of the silence between the voices, something heavy and transactional and entirely wrong, kept her from announcing herself. She stood in the shadow of the library doorway and watched her father sell her. Arthur Vance sat behind the mahogany desk, his face slick with the sweat of a man in the final stages of desperation. His cravat was undone. His hands shook so violently that when he dipped the silver quill into the inkwell a black drop splattered across the signature line, blotting the parchment like a small wound. He had been an honorable man once. Eleanor knew this not from memory but from the accounts of people who had known him before the cards took his judgment, before the clubs of Mayfair stripped his pride down to its raw and terrible underside. Silas Thorne sat on the library sofa with the comfortable authority of a man who has won and knows it. He was a large man, heavy through the chest and shoulders, wearing a riding coat that smelled of damp wool and old tobacco. A heavy gold signet ring turned over his knuckles as he watched Arthur Vance sign away the last thing he had left to sign. His dark eyes had not moved from Eleanor's silhouette since she appeared in the doorway, even though she was standing in shadow and he should not have been able to see her at all. "Sign the paper," Thorne said. The carriage is waiting in the yard. The tide changes at dawn. It is done, Arthur Vance whispered. He pushed the parchment away from himself without looking at his daughter. You will have a roof, Thorne has promised to clear the markers. Eleanor stepped out of the shadow and into the lamplight. The house is already his, she said. Her voice was completely calm, the way very deep water is calm, not because nothing is happening beneath the surface but because the surface has decided not to reflect it. You have sold the horses and you have sold the silver and now you have signed the girl. Do not look for comfort in the words you use to justify this. There are no words for it. Arthur Vance did not raise his eyes from the desk. He had long since run out of the capacity to look directly at the cost of the things he chose. Thorne stood up. He was very large when he stood, large enough to block the light from the oil lamp on the sideboard and cast the corner of the library into darkness. He walked toward Eleanor with the deliberate pace of a man who has acquired something and is coming to collect it. His boots were loud on the old floorboards. He raised one thick hand and gripped her jaw, his fingers rough and cold against her skin, turning her face toward the lamplight as though she were livestock he was checking before transport. That was the moment the oak doors came off their hinges. They did not open. They did not swing back on a dramatic gust of winter wind. They ruptured inward with the force of something that had decided the doors were not an obstacle worth acknowledging, and in the same instant the blizzard was inside the library, freezing air, white snow, the howling dark of a December storm that extinguished every candle in the room and left them all in the gray half-light of a winter that had just been let in. The man who came through the ruin of the doorway was not a man designed for drawing rooms. He stood 6 feet and 3 inches tall in the center of the destroyed entrance, his black greatcoat white with frost, his boots leaving wet black prints on the pale rug. He had dark hair, long for the fashion, damp against his forehead from the storm. And down the left side of his face, beginning at his temple and running through his eyebrow and across his cheekbone to the line of his jaw, was a scar of considerable violence, jagged and white and old, the kind of mark that does not fade but simply becomes part of a face's architecture, as permanent as the bones beneath it. Julian Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ashmore, did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at Arthur Vance, who had gone the color of old wax and pressed himself back against the bookcase with the instincts of a man who recognizes a predator. He looked only at Thorne, with the calm, particular focus of a man who has located the specific problem in a room and has already decided on its resolution. He threw a thick leather portfolio onto the desk. It landed with the flat authority of a completed argument. The markers are void, Julian said. His voice was low and absolutely even, the voice of a man who has not raised it in years because there has never been sufficient reason to. The deed is mine. The girl stays here. Thorne's hand fell from Eleanor's jaw. His voice had lost several of its previous registers when he spoke. The contract is signed. The law gives her to me. Julian Blackwood moved. He crossed the library in 4 strides, caught Thorne by the lapels of his heavy coat and lifted him, entirely clear of the floor, his boots dangling above the rug, and carried him backward into the stone masonry of the fireplace. The impact was not gentle. The mantelpiece shuddered. The clock on it did not survive the encounter. The law, Julian said, does not live in this house tonight. I purchased the syndicate debt at 11 o'clock this evening. I purchased this house from the solicitors at midnight. He looked at Thorne the way you look at something you have already discarded. You have 60 seconds to leave this property before I remember that I came here for a negotiation and not for the other thing. He released Thorne. The Baron landed badly, clawing at his throat, and did not stop moving until he was through the ruined doorway and swallowed by the blizzard. Julian turned to Arthur Vance. Leave, he said. The old man did not look at his daughter. He took his coat from the back of the chair and walked out of the library and down the dark hallway and into the snow, and Eleanor heard the sound of his footsteps for the last time as they faded into the storm. The library was quiet then, except for the wind through the shattered entrance and the sound of Eleanor's breathing, which she was working to keep steady. Julian Blackwood unfastened the silver clasp of his greatcoat. He stripped the heavy frost-covered garment from his shoulders and walked toward her. He was careful about it, not the approach of a man claiming something, but the approach of a man who has calculated that the woman before him is cold and that he has a coat and that the distance between those two facts requires only one action. He draped the warm wool around her trembling shoulders, enclosing her in the smell of cedar and frost and something darker underneath, wood smoke, sea air, the particular cold of a man who had ridden through a blizzard for reasons he had not explained. "The carriage is waiting," he said. "We have 3 days north." She looked up at him. His face in the lamplight was all shadow and scar and the flat, careful expressionlessness of a man who had been called mad for long enough that the label had become a kind of weather, simply the condition of his existence. She did not ask where north was. She did not ask what 3 days meant. She had just watched her father sign her name on a document in a library that no longer belonged to either of them, and the storm outside was absolute, and the man before her, whatever else he was, had just placed himself between her and a far worse alternative. She pulled his coat tighter around herself and walked out through the ruin of the doorway into the blizzard. The carriage that took Eleanor Vance north was the finest vehicle she had ever been inside, which was not, given the last 3 years, a high bar to clear. The interior was lined with deep blue velvet and warmed by heated bricks that the grooms replaced at every posting in along the road. There were blankets and a small covered basket of provisions, and a window that could be opened or shut with a brass mechanism that worked smoothly. Everything about the carriage spoke of money applied to practical problems, not the excessive decoration of wealth performing itself, but the clean efficiency of serious resources seriously deployed. Julian Blackwood did not enter the carriage for a single mile of the 3-day journey. He rode outside on horseback for the entire distance, leading the small party through sleet and wind in a December landscape that offered no comfort to anyone moving through it. At every posting in a private parlor was waiting for Eleanor with a fire built up and a tray of warm food and the nervous deference of innkeepers who have been warned by someone to expect her. The Duke never shared her table. He remained in the yard with the horses, or took a solitary glass in the public taproom, and Eleanor watched him through the inn windows and tried to make sense of the architecture of a man who had destroyed 2 doors and a clock on her behalf and would not sit in the same room long enough to be thanked. On the 3rd afternoon, the horses turned through iron gates that had been standing for long enough that the ironwork had grown into the stone of the posts around them. The drive climbed upward through dead winter grass, and at the top of the rise Blackwood Manor appeared. It was not what she had expected. She had expected something grand and maintained and oppressively aristocratic. What she found was a fortress, the correct word, because it had clearly been built as one, its walls of black rock the same material as the cliff it sat on, its parapets worn smooth by centuries of salt wind off the North Sea below. The eastern portion of the house was intact and enormous, its windows dark in the grey afternoon. The western portion was a hollow shell. A fire had eaten through it at some point within the last decade, leaving a skeleton of blackened timber and scorched granite, its empty windows staring at the sea like eyes that had long ago stopped expecting anything from it. The smell of old charcoal and brine reached Eleanor before the carriage stopped. Julian stood near his horse at the far side of the courtyard, his back to the sea, his dark hair wet with sleet, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. The old butler named Thomas opened the carriage door and took her hand with the practiced care of a man who had spent decades serving a household that required careful handling. Julian spoke without crossing to her. "Give her the east wing rooms," he said to Thomas. "Keep the fires going. She is not to be disturbed unless she asks for something." He turned toward the stables. His coat was still white with frost at the shoulders. "Am I a guest or a prisoner?" Eleanor called out. Her voice crossed the courtyard cleanly over the sound of the waves beating the cliff below. He stopped. His shoulders locked beneath the wet coat. He turned his head slowly and she saw the full length of the scar in the grey afternoon light, all of it, unobscured, the jagged white line from temple to jaw that was the first thing anyone saw and apparently the last thing anyone looked past. "The gates are open, Miss Vance," he said. "The stables are full of horses. If you wish to leave, a carriage will be ready by morning. If you stay, you answer to no one in this house." He went into the shadow of the stone archway and did not look back. Eleanor looked at the closed archway for a moment. Then she looked at the burnt-out western wing, the black eye socket windows staring at the sea. Then she looked at the grey churning water below the cliff, which was the most honest and indifferent thing she had ever seen, and found it clarifying. She went inside. She spent 4 days in the East Wing with the books and the silence and the servants who moved through the corridors like shadows, answering her questions in brief, careful sentences that told her everything about Julian Blackwood's management of his own household and nothing about Julian Blackwood himself. The rooms were clean and adequately furnished and entirely impersonal in the way of rooms maintained for a purpose rather than inhabited with any intention of comfort. On the 5th morning she grew tired of the silence in the way she had always grown tired of inaction, not with restlessness but with a precise, focused irritation at the waste of it. She had not survived 3 years of her father's financial unraveling by sitting in rooms and waiting. She went down the back stairs and found the steward's office behind the kitchens, a small dark room dense with the accumulated disorder of a man who was exhausted and competent but had run out of hours in the day. The ledgers were stacked without organization. The correspondence was filed by no system she could identify. The inkwells had dried to crust in their holders. And the old steward, Miller, who stood up so quickly when she entered that his chair scraped back against the wall, had the red eyes of a man who had been sleeping 3 hours a night for the better part of a year. She sat down in his chair, pushed the lamp to where she could see, and began. Miller stared at her. "My lady, His Grace's instructions were that you should rest. His Grace is losing £40 a week through improper grain calculations," Eleanor said, opening the top ledger. "Your summer tax assessment has been running against the winter crop rolls since Michaelmas. Move the lamp closer." The old man moved the lamp. She spent the next 3 weeks in that office with her hair pinned back and her sleeves rolled up against the ink, and she did not return to the East Wing sitting rooms for any purpose other than sleeping. She reorganized the tenant rolls and found 12 families who had been paying double tithes for 2 years because a dead clerk's old lease had never been struck from the records. She corrected the timber receipts from the Hull merchants, who had been inflating their invoices by 4% above contract and relying on Miller's exhaustion to avoid notice. She met with the bailiff about the coastal farm repairs and negotiated the carpenter's price down by 1/3 on the grounds that she had read the county rates and knew exactly what the work cost and exactly what they were trying to charge. She brought order to a house that had been drifting in the dark for 5 years. And at every stage of this work, at every corrected ledger and renegotiated contract and straightened record, she was aware, without ever articulating it, that she was doing something else as well. She was mapping the ruin. She was learning the shape of what had been abandoned here. And in the patterns of neglect and the gaps in the accounts and the specific ways this house had been left to manage itself, she was beginning to read the outline of the man who had walked away from all of it. Julian Blackwood found her at 11 o'clock on a January evening in his private library, the one room he had kept locked from the servants, the one room in the East Wing that had never been offered to her. He had been on the cliffs since dark, walking the sheepfolds with the head shepherd after a coastguard warning about the incoming gale. He came in from the cold with his boots full of wet sand and the smell of salt and wind on his coat, expecting the empty darkness he had inhabited for 5 years. He opened the library door and found it blazing with lamplight. Every desk lamp was lit. His private correspondence files were spread across the table in organized chronological stacks with small white notation slips attached to the margins. His timber receipts from the Hull merchants were sorted by date and cross-referenced against the contract rates. And Eleanor Vance was sitting in his leather chair with her spectacles on the bridge of her nose, making a neat annotation in the margin of a receipt with the focused calm of a woman who has found where the problem lives and is addressing it. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You are very difficult to ignore, Miss Vance," he said. He did not take off his hat. He did not come fully into the room. He stood in the threshold with his arms crossed and the flat, guarded expressionlessness of a man who has been startled but will not perform surprise. "The Hull merchants are 4% above the winter contract rate," Eleanor said, without looking up. "They have been doing it since October. They counted on Miller being too tired to catch it. I have written to their factor indicating that we will use the Scarborough timber from Friday if the discrepancy is not corrected. Julian walked into the lamplight. He placed both hands on the green leather surface of the desk and leaned over the papers and over her, and the scar on his temple was dark and sharp in the warm oil lamp glow. I did not buy your father's debts to acquire a clerk, he said. Eleanor took her spectacles off. She looked up at him directly, which required some angle given the difference in their heights, and met his eyes without adjustment. You bought my father's debts because you wanted to deny Silas Thorne the satisfaction of owning something he desired, she said. Do not dress it as philanthropy, Your Grace. You do not have the face of a man who performs philanthropy. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, And what face do I have? He turned his head slightly as he said it, with the deliberate, practiced quality of a man who has used his own scar as a weapon of deflection for so long that the gesture has become automatic. Presenting the damage. Inviting the flinch. Eleanor did not flinch. You have the face of a man who has constructed a very effective lie and been living in it for so long he has mistaken it for the truth, she said. She stood up from the chair. She moved around the edge of the desk until she was standing directly before him, close enough to see the fine grain of the skin around the old wound, close enough to see that what was in his eyes was not madness, had never been madness, but was something considerably more painful and considerably more human. I read the trial papers, she said. I found them in the locked drawer you forgot to lock when you moved the estate files to the second shelf. I know Lady Sarah signed the bank transfers before the fire. I know your brother was already dead when the roof came down. I know the inquest was conducted by men who owed money to people who found your conviction convenient. Julian went completely rigid. His breath shortened to the shallow, controlled rhythm of a man who is deciding whether he is going to maintain a wall or let it fall. Those files were private, he said. The drawer was unlocked, she said. She raised her right hand. She placed her palm flat and warm and entirely deliberate against the left side of his face, her fingers spanning the full length of the scar, her thumb resting in the hollow of his cheekbone. She felt the ridge of the old wound under her skin. She did not pull away. You let the world call you mad, she said, because madness frightens people into not looking closely. If they are afraid of what you might do, they will never look carefully enough to see what was done to you. It is a very efficient piece of architecture. But the foundations are rotted, Julian. You cannot live in a lie indefinitely, even a useful one. He looked at her hand on his face. He had gone very still in the way of a man who has encountered something his body does not know how to respond to because it has been too long since anything like it was offered. No one has touched this face in 5 years, he said. The words were barely sound. They were said to the floor. Then the people in your life were cowards, Eleanor said. She kept her hand where it was. I am the daughter of a man who signed my name on a document at midnight and walked away without looking at me. I know the difference between a man who hurts and a man who is hurt. I know it the way you know the difference between a fire that destroys and a fire that is burning to keep something alive. Julian raised his own hand. His fingers hovered above her wrist, wanting to hold her there, wanting to receive the warmth of it, and holding himself back with the disciplined restraint of a man who has spent 5 years learning not to want things because wanting things leads to burning rooms and dead brothers and trial papers and the rest of it. He did not take her wrist. But he did not look away. If this story has you holding your breath, if Eleanor's hand on that scarred face has your chest tight, then this channel is exactly where you are supposed to be. Every story told at Regent Hearts is about a woman who saw through the lie that the world told about someone and chose the truth instead. Every week, a new story. Every story, worth the wait. Subscribe now if you have not already. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from, your city and your country. We read every single one. And share this with someone who needs to hear that the ruins are not the end of the story. We are going back in. The winter ball is coming. And Julian Blackwood is about to walk into the most dangerous room in Yorkshire. The winter relief ball at the County Assembly Rooms was the first social acknowledgement the Blackwood estate had offered to Yorkshire society in 5 years. Julian had not intended to attend. He had thrown the gilt-edged invitation directly into the study fire when it arrived in December and watched the paper curl black without any particular feeling about the matter. He had not attended a social function since before the fire, since before the trial, since before the world had decided on the specific story it was going to tell about him and committed to the telling of it with the enthusiasm of people who enjoy a monster considerably more than they enjoy a man. But Eleanor had retrieved the charred fragment from the embers the next morning. She had laid it on his desk alongside the corrected quarterly accounts and the renegotiated timber contracts and the 12 tenant families whose double tithes had been returned, and she had said, "If you do not go, they will say the madness is winning. If you go alone, they will watch you for weakness. If you go with me they will have to look at the ledgers instead, and the ledgers are immaculate." He had looked at her for a long time. Then he had gone to find Thomas and told him to have the traveling carriage ready on the evening of the 15th. The assembly rooms in the county town were blazing with candlelight and the heavy sweet smell of hothouse lilies cut too early and hot wax and powder and the particular quality of social anticipation that operates when an entire county has been waiting for something to happen. The gentry of Yorkshire had turned out in their finest, the women in silk and velvet, the men in their best evening coats, and the quality of their waiting, the particular tension in the room, was not the anticipation of entertainment but the anticipation of spectacle. Julian Blackwood had not been seen in public for 5 years. They had been told he was mad. They had believed it without much investigation. And now the doors were about to open. When the butler announced the Duke and his companion, every conversation in the room died. Julian walked in with his head high and his face completely uncovered, the full length of the scar visible in the ballroom candlelight. He had not hidden it. He had not turned his head or arranged himself to minimize it. He wore a black velvet coat cut close through the shoulders and he walked with the unhurried pace of a man who has decided that this room does not have the power to make him smaller and is demonstrating the decision physically. Eleanor walked beside him. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, not clutching, not performing support, simply present, the way a hand on an arm means, "I am here and I have chosen to be." She wore an emerald silk gown of elegant simplicity, her dark hair pinned up with no ornament, and she did not look at the floor for a single step of the entrance. She looked at the crowd. She looked at them the way she had looked at the ledgers, clearly, directly, with the focused attention of a woman who intends to understand the full shape of what she is looking at. The whispers began while they were still in the entrance. She heard her own name in them, fractured and moving through the room like a crack through ice. A girl without a dowry. A father who fled to the continent. Bought in the dark for £50,000. She heard these things and she did not change her pace or her posture and she did not take her hand from Julian's arm. Silas Thorne was standing near the refreshment table. He had not left Yorkshire after the blizzard. He had retreated to his own estate and spent 6 weeks constructing an alternative position, aided by the London syndicate men who stood around him now in their expensive coats with their flat creditors' eyes and their belief that money and legal technicality were the same thing as power. He walked into the center of the floor and blocked their path to the dais with the confidence of a man who has prepared his speech and rehearsed his delivery and genuinely believes that public humiliation is a kind of legal argument. "Your Grace," he said, pitching his voice to carry to every corner of the silent room. "I believe there is an unresolved matter regarding the Vance estate betrothal contract. The Church Court in London has not formally voided the document signed on the night of the blizzard. The law of contract." Julian stepped in front of Eleanor. Not dramatically. Not with any performance of protection. He simply moved so that his body was between Thorne and the woman beside him, and his size was considerable, and Thorne's view of Eleanor became a view of a black velvet coat and the full calm attention of a man who has absolutely no concerns about the outcome of the next 60 seconds. "The contract was voided by royal decree yesterday morning," Julian said. The words fell into the silence of the room with the flat, final quality of a verdict already rendered. "The Lord Chancellor signed the order after reviewing your syndicate's accounting methods for the Wiltshire estates. There is a warrant for your arrest. The sheriff is outside. You have 10 minutes. The syndicate men behind Thorne looked at each other. They had the professional ability to recognize a completely lost position, and what they saw in the room, the Duke's absolute stillness, the royal decree, the sheriff's presence implied beyond the doors, was exactly that. They moved toward the exit without discussing it. Thorne's face went through several colors before he followed them. The music resumed. It was thin and nervous at first, the orchestra recalibrating, and then it found its footing and the room began to breathe again, and the whispers resumed behind the fans and the pillars with the revived energy of people who have just been given considerably more to discuss than they had anticipated. A girl without a dowry. Bought in the dark. Eleanor stepped out from behind Julian's shoulder. She turned and faced the room, not aggressively, not with the rigid dignity of someone managing an affront, but with the simple, direct openness of a woman who has nothing to perform and nothing to hide and is simply standing in her own life, looking at the people who are looking at her. Julian turned to face her. And in his face, in the lamplight of the assembly room with 200 Yorkshire gentry watching from behind their fans, was the expression that made the whispers falter and eventually, permanently, stop. He offered her his hand. "Will you dance, Duchess?" he said. It was the first time he had used the title. It was not a performance. It was a declaration of exactly the kind that does not require a speech, the kind that is made in a single word, in front of people who will remember it. "I am not very accomplished at the waltz," Eleanor said. Her voice was low, for him alone. "I spent my youth with ledgers rather than dancing masters." "I have not danced in 5 years," he said. His hand was steady. His eyes did not leave her face. "We can be clumsy together in front of all of them. It will give them something new to catalogue." She took his hand. They moved on to the floor and they were not technically accomplished. Her velvet skirt caught on his boot at the second turn. They missed the rotation at the third corner and had to compensate in a way that made an older woman near the wall put down her punch glass and stare. They were, by any reasonable assessment of ballroom form, a spectacle. But they danced with their heads up and their eyes on each other, and the absolute, unambiguous quality of two people who are somewhere specific and mean to be there, and the room watched them with the slowly changing expression of 200 people realizing that what they were looking at was not a madman and his purchased girl but something they did not have a convenient category for, something that required them to revise their accounting. When he looked at her in the light of the central chandelier, the scar was simply part of his face. It was simply the face of the man who had brought her out of the ruins, who was, Eleanor now understood completely, a man who had been living in his own ruins for 5 years, waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to come in with a lamp and a ledger and the willingness to look at the full shape of what had happened here. The library fire had burned down to a deep bed of red embers by the time the carriage returned to Blackwood Manor. The house was quiet around them, the servants retired for the night, the wind off the sea softer than it had been in weeks, the gale spent, the air cleared, the sky over the North Sea showing a thin pale line of stars between the breaking clouds. Eleanor stood at the library table in her emerald ballgown with the clasp undone at her throat, looking down at the leather portfolio that Julian had placed on the desk before they left. It held 3 documents. The first was the deed to the Vance estate, cleared of all encumbrance, her name alone on the title line. The second was a bank draft for £100,000 deposited in an account in her name at the London banking house, money that was hers, entirely and irrevocably hers, dependent on no one and no arrangement. The third was a letter from the Lord Chancellor's office confirming that the betrothal contract Silas Thorne had been attempting to enforce had no legal standing and had been formally voided. Julian stood near the window. He had removed his coat. His white shirt was open at the throat and he looked at her with the quiet, stripped-back exhaustion of a man who has finished the work he set himself and is waiting to discover what the finish means. "The deed is yours," he said. "The income from the estate timber contracts will provide £3,000 a year independent of any other arrangement." He said it carefully, the words of a man who has prepared this speech and is giving it accurately. "You have standing and you have money and no one who was in that room tonight will ever dare to diminish you again." He gestured toward the window and the carriage road visible beyond it, the horses being rubbed down in the lamplight of the stable yard. "The road is open," he said. "Whenever you wish to take it." Eleanor looked at the portfolio for a long moment. She picked up the deed and looked at it, her name on the title line, the estate her father had dissolved around her now restored and returned, the full weight of what this represented entirely legible to a woman who had spent 3 years understanding exactly what documents like this cost. She looked at the bank draft. £100,000. Enough to live as she chose for the rest of her life. Enough to live entirely alone, entirely free, entirely answerable to no one. She set both documents down. She picked up the entire portfolio. And she walked to the fireplace and placed it in the embers. The leather caught first, a low hiss and then a bright yellow flare that threw sudden sharp light across the dark library walls. The parchment of the deed went next, the ink going first, the black letters of her name, the clauses of the agreement, the Lord Chancellor's seal, all of it dissolving upward in grey smoke. The bank draft was the last to go, the numbers remaining visible for a single moment in the red light before the paper curled and went to ash. Julian crossed the room in 2 strides. His hands reached toward the fireplace before the thought was complete, the instinct of a man watching something irreplaceable destroyed. Eleanor stood between him and the fire. "That was your independence," he said. His voice had lost its careful flatness. "That was everything." "I am already independent," she said. She said it without raising her voice, which made it considerably more final than if she had. She looked at him in the firelight and said, "I spent 23 years being useful to people who did not see me as anything beyond my usefulness. My father used my arithmetic to cover what he could not face. Thorne wanted my name to clean the appearance of what he was. Every arrangement I was ever offered was an offer to be used for some purpose other than myself." She took 1 step toward him. The ember light was very warm on her face. "You are the only man who has ever looked at me and seen something worth protecting for my own sake," she said. "Not for the use of me. For me." Julian Blackwood stood very still. The firelight caught the scar and made it warm, and the set of his jaw was the set of a man who is trying to maintain a structure he has maintained for 5 years and is losing the battle with it. "Eleanor," he said. "Look at this face. Look at this house. I am a man who lives in a blackened ruin at the edge of the sea. I am the man they made a trial of. I am the thing they used to frighten people at dinner tables across 3 counties. I am not. You are," she said. She walked into the space between them, which was not much space, and raised both hands and took him by the sides of his neck, gently, entirely deliberately, and pulled his head down until his scarred cheek was resting against her forehead. She felt the ridge of the old wound against her skin and kept her hands where they were. "You are not the story they told about you," she said against his temple. "You are the man who rode through a blizzard in December to prevent something terrible from happening to someone he did not know. You are the man who has 3,000 books in a library and has read most of them. You are the man whose tenants have been paying double tithes for 2 years because he was too buried in his own grief to check the records, which is not a character flaw, Julian, it is a symptom of being a person who has been carrying something uncarryable alone for too long." She felt the long breath that went through him, the deep, slow exhale of a man releasing a weight from a place he had forgotten was holding it. "I am not going back to London," she said. "The architecture there is too small for me. I am staying here. In this ruin. With you." The sound that came out of Julian Blackwood then was not a sound he had planned or prepared or managed in any way. It was the sound of something that had been locked down so long it had forgotten its own name, raw and brief and entirely real, the sound of a grief that has been sitting in someone's chest since the night a roof fell and a brother died and the wrong story was told and the right man went silent rather than fight a version of events the world had already decided to believe. He caught her by the waist with both hands and lifted her clear of the floor and held her against his chest with the full, fierce, careful strength of a man who has been given something he did not know he was still capable of wanting, and he kissed her with the complete devotion of a man who has been starving for a very long time and has finally, irrevocably, been brought to the table. He kissed her until the wind outside was irrelevant. He kissed her until the blackened timbers of the West Wing were simply old charcoal, nothing more. He kissed her until Yorkshire and the assembly room and the 200 people with their whispers and their fans were simply part of the geography of a world they were no longer required to perform for. When he finally set her down, his hand stayed in her hair, his thumb moving along the line of her jaw with a tenderness that was the opposite of everything he had ever been called. The scar on his cheek was simply the place where her fingers rested. It was simply part of his face. It was simply him. "I will make you the lady of this house, Eleanor," he said against her hair. "Whatever it needs, I will build it back." She pulled back enough to look at him. Her expression had the particular quality of a woman who has made a decision and found it exactly right and is entirely at peace with the weight of it. "I am already the master of your ledgers," she said. "The title is simply a matter of accounting." He laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, warm, a sound that moved through the quiet house the way the first warm wind of spring moves through a building that has been shut up all winter, reaching the cold corners, finding the places where the frost has been sitting, and changing the temperature of everything. They stood together by the library window as the blizzard gave up its last argument and thinned away to nothing, and beyond the retreating clouds the North Sea was briefly, perfectly silver in the first pale light of a dawn that had no interest in the stories people told about them. The father had sold her at midnight for £50,000, believing he was resolving a debt. The Duke had bought the entire estate at midnight for £50,000, believing he was preventing an injustice. Both of them had been right about what they were doing and completely wrong about what would happen next. Because the mathematics of two people who refuse to be diminished is not additive. It is not the sum of their separate strengths. It is something else entirely, a different kind of accounting, one that does not appear in any ledger Eleanor had ever balanced, in any book Julian had ever read. It is the mathematics of a ruin becoming a foundation. It is the arithmetic of a woman who survived being sold and a man who survived being destroyed, standing in the same room, in the same firelight, looking at the same horizon, and deciding together that what has been broken is not the end of what can be built. If Eleanor standing between Julian and that fire, burning her own freedom to choose the life she actually wanted, gave you absolute chills, then you are exactly where you are supposed to be. This is Regent Hearts, and every story we tell here is about a woman who did the brave thing when the easy thing was available. Every story is about a man who had to be seen clearly before he could be loved properly. Every story is about what happens when two people decide that the ruins are not a monument to what was lost but a foundation for what is about to be built. Subscribe right now to become part of this community. Drop a comment below with your city and country. We read every single one and we want to know where in the world this story found you. Share this video with one person who needs to hear that being sold in the dark is not the end of your story. The next story is already in production. It is worth the wait. We will see you there.